Good evening, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to listen to this extremely important initiative that addresses police reform in Oneida and Herkimer County and the state of New York. The work that the College Community Partnership for Racial Justice is doing and has been doing over the past several months is in response to Governor Andrew Cuomo's executive order on police reform. It is a response to the fact that, unfortunately, too many people of color, especially in the Black community, across New York State and across this country, do not feel that they are treated fairly by law enforcement officers. Before I get further into my remarks, I would like to acknowledge the reality that policing is tough work. Yet it is a noble profession when done correctly and professionally. I would be remiss if I did not publicly salute Chief Mark Williams, Chief of the Utica Police Department, in his efforts to make Utica police officers more sensitive to the residents they are serving here in Utica. I've had the privilege of working with him for several years, and I know the work that he has put in. Yet we still have a substantial ways to go. The Utica Police Department has come a long way under the leadership of Chief Mark Williams, Mayor Robert Palmieri, and Deputy Chief Ed Noonan. Back to why we are here. According to Governor Andrew Cuomo, this is about fostering trust, fairness, and legitimacy in policing. We didn't end up here in this place overnight. There's a long history about policing and communities that they police. And very often the job is done well, but unfortunately, there are challenges, especially in communities of color. I've had the privilege of living in this community here in Utica, New York for decades. And unfortunately, there have been far too many reports and allegations of misconduct by police officers towards the citizens that they are serving. These are allegations. One of the biggest complaints that people of color have against police is how they speak to them. This is across the country and here in New York State. And yes, sometimes here in the Mohawk Valley. However, when people feel that they are not respected by the people who are hired to protect and serve, they lose trust. Simply put, too often, Black and brown people are having a less than pleasant interaction with police. We are at a watershed moment in this country to change that dynamic, and I'm confident we can do it. I would like to take this time to appeal to the residents of Utica, Rome, New Hartford, towns and villages, and all across America to also make sure that you treat police with respect as well. There are many good police officers. I will say that again. There are many good police officers. Don't indict them all because you've had a bad experience with some. What I want to respectfully say to every police officer in Utica, Rome, New Hartford, and all across America is please treat everyone, especially people who have been historically oppressed and discriminated against, as if he or she were your best friend. My recommendation is when you are dealing with people who are racially and culturally different than you, do your best to show you care and respect. You'll be that cop that people grow to respect. John Templeton once said, "It's nice to be important, but it's more important to be nice." Beginning in the fall of 2020, the College Community Partnership for Racial Justice, under the leadership of Professor Frank Anechiarico, hosted several webinars that address notable topics that pertain to police reform. These topics included Black Lives Matter, what is systemic racism, why is diversity not enough, when it comes to hiring in police departments. We even had a session that looks at reform in the entire criminal justice system. Our last session included remarks from Chief Mark Williams, Chief of the United County Sheriff's Department, Rob Maceo, and Rome Police Chief, Mr. Bates. There was extensive research done by both professors and students at Hamilton College and Utica College on best practices in policing. Thank you for your hard work. The College Community Partnership for Racial Justice and Police Reform also partnered with Zogby Analytics, the United Way of the Mohawk Valley and their 211 system, and Utica Street Team. This was done for the purpose of interviewing people about their experiences with law enforcement. We focused on Herkimer and Oneida County. While we were not able to interview everyone as we would have liked in the two counties about their experiences with law enforcement, it did give us some sample of people's experiences with law enforcement. Thank you to all three organizations for your hard work. In closing, we would like to send a big thank you to the Community Foundation of Herkimer and Oneida County, also the United Way of the Mohawk Valley, for their support of this important project. I will now turn it over to Beminde Johnson, Associate Professor of Government at Hamilton College, and Ronnie Tishner, Professor of Sociology at SUNY Poly. Together, they will discuss the results of the surveys that were conducted this past summer. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Patrick. As Patrick stated, the College Community Partnership created a survey to ask questions about community wellness, interactions with police, and thoughts on alternative forms of policing. So before getting to the results, I want to discuss the composition of the three surveys. So, as Patrick mentioned, one of the ways in which we collected responses to the survey was through Zogby Strategies. They conducted a poll of Oneida and Herkimer County residents in late August, and there were 500 respondents. The sample was 50% from Rome and Utica, 25% from Oneida, and 25% from Herkimer County. The sample was 87% white, 13% non-white. The gender breakdown was about even. In terms of education, 31% stated they had a bachelor's degree or higher, and 44% stated that they had some college or an associate's degree. And in terms of income, 65% stated that they made $60,000 or less. The second sample we collected was through the United Way's 211 texting option. And this option was publicized in a number of ways. The Oneida County Sheriff's through the Oneida County Sheriff Department, billboards, public service announcements, and an op-ed. We retrieved 150 responses. This sample, 85% white, 8% non-white, with a portion declining to answer. The gender breakdown is skewed a bit, almost 2/3 female. And it's skewed in terms of education and income as well. 55% stated that they had a bachelor's degree or higher, which is a bit high. And in terms of income, 66% stated that they made $60,000 or more. The third way in which we retrieved results was with the paper survey option. And this was fielded by Patrick Johnson and the street team in Cornhill, in the Cornhill region of Utica. And the way there were various methods for collecting these responses. They included door-to-door or asking individuals in the Cornhill area if they would fill out the survey. And this retrieved 94 responses. So this sample is majority non-white, 84% respondents are non-white, with majority African-American respondents, about 66%. In terms of gender, almost even, 47% female, 51% male, and then 2% non-binary or other. Education, 3% responded that they had a bachelor's degree, but 36% stating that they had some college or an associate's degree. Income, the sample is majority low income as well. 34% stated they had an income between $10,000 and $40,000, with over half stating that their income was less than $10,000. So I'm going to get into the results, and it's always important to be careful when comparing different samples. However, the results are very informative in terms of the questions that we sought to answer. So first, one of the questions was about quality of life. The respondents were asked if the quality of life in their neighborhood had improved or stayed the same. And we see here majorities across all three samples either said it improved or stayed the same. However, a smaller majority of Cornhill residents stated that it had either stayed the same or improved, which means that a larger portion of the Cornhill residents stated that the quality had declined. Another question was, do you feel safe in your home? This question has implication for issues such as domestic violence. And once again, majorities across samples stated that they do feel safe in their home. However, a small majority of Cornhill residents stated that they feel safe in their home, with 70% compared to approximately 90% across the other two surveys. In terms of feeling safe outside of my home, very similar. 80% of Zogby and nearly 80% of 211 respondents stated that they feel safe. A majority of Cornhill residents did as well, but a smaller majority with 61%. We asked if individuals had been a victim of crime in the past 12 months. Thankfully, a minority responded yes, but we can see the largest group here being the Cornhill respondents, with 18% stating that they had been a victim of crime in the past 12 months. Now, we asked a number of questions about interactions with police here. We asked if you had ever been stopped or questioned by police. The largest group responding affirmatively was were the Cornhill respondents with 53%, and 211, 43%, and Zogby, 36%. Another question was if you had ever been treated inappropriately by the police. One thing to say about this question, there was some response roll off, because if you really haven't had interactions with the police, you may not respond to this question. But of those who responded, a majority of Cornhill residents responded affirmatively that they had been treated inappropriately by the police, with about 20% of Zogby and 211 survey residents stating the same. In terms of the relationship between the police and the neighborhood, we can see substantial differences here between the Cornhill responses and the Zogby and the 211, with a large majority of Zogby and 211 respondents stating that they agree that the relationship between the police and the neighborhood is excellent, with only 38% of the Cornhill residents stating similarly. The police that serve my area can be trusted. This is an important question. Of course, if there's trust, then you also have greater information exchange. Here, Zogby and 211, large majorities agreeing that they can trust the police that serve their area. But once again, with the Cornhill respondents, a much smaller portion of respondents agreeing that the police that serve their area can be trusted. And another really important question, should police live in the area that they serve? What's interesting is that even though we saw substantial differences across the responses to trust and the state of their relationship, we see very similar responses here to this question of should police live where they serve. With the Cornhill and 211 respondents, even though these samples are very different, basically responding identically, that they do agree that the police should live in the area that they serve. And what this could indicate, particularly with the Cornhill respondents, is a desire for more community closeness with the police that serve the area. And if there's time, Patrick Johnson can elaborate on this. But now I'm going to turn it over to Professor Veronica Tishner to continue discussing the survey results.
Thank you very much, Momende. So moving on with the comparisons across the three survey samples, we asked questions about issues that are of interest to the public. Momende, I'm not able to see the slides anymore.
Yeah, hold on. Oh, here we go. Can you see them now?
Yes, thank you so much. Yeah, right. So we asked, there have been, with the Black Lives Matter movement and protests and discourse around this issue, there's been a lot of discussion about what kind of incidents the police can best handle. And so we did ask questions about a couple of things in particular, and one of them was domestic violence. And so what you see here is we asked people to say whether they strongly agree or somewhat agree that domestic violence can best be handled by the police. And we see large majorities here agreeing with that, including in Cornhill. But then when we asked them a different question, which was, it would be better if we use other interventions for domestic violence. You can see, again, majorities agreeing with that statement, but then the number for Cornhill is quite a bit higher than it is for both Zogby and the 211 survey. We also asked about misbehavior due to mental illness. And so we made the statement that's best handled by the police, and you get less agreement with that than with domestic violence. And in particular, you see that you don't even get majorities agreeing in Cornhill or the 211 survey with that statement. And then when we ask the related question, it's better if other interventions are used for misbehavior due to mental illness. Here you do see strong majorities agreeing with that statement across all three samples. The other question we asked was, non-criminal emergency calls, should they be handled by unarmed service providers? And you see a stark contrast there between Cornhill and the other samples, where you get a plurality of folks saying, yeah, that could be a good idea, but in Cornhill, overwhelmingly, the sentiment was that it would be best to have someone other than police answer those kinds of calls. We also asked questions, as Bemende said early on, about the climate in the area, particularly around racial and ethnic bias. And so the first question we asked was whether people agreed that racism and ethnic bias are serious problems in our area. And again, you see a majority of the 211, an overwhelming majority of the Cornhill survey respondents agreeing with that statement. And then we also asked about race and ethnic bias in specific areas of criminal justice. And one of them was the statement, race and ethnicity determine how one is treated by the police. Again, majorities across all three samples, but we see that in Cornhill, that majority is much larger. Similarly, for race and ethnicity determined treatment by the courts. Not quite a majority for Zogby, but definitely for 211, and a much higher percentage at 82% for Cornhill residents. So the other contrast we wanted to show you is that within the Zogby poll, there was a distinction. People did identify between non and non-white, and we wanted to show the difference between the two subgroups within that those survey results, because those are instructive. A little bit of caution in looking at them, because the sample was overwhelmingly white. And so we have to be a little bit careful, because the numbers of non-white respondents were small in comparison, but there are still some very interesting differences that emerge. So when we go through these same questions, quality of life in my neighborhood has improved or stayed the same, pretty similar answers for both white and non-white respondents. I feel safe in my home. White respondents are more likely to respond, but still overwhelming majorities of white and non-white respondents agreed with that. I feel safe outside my home. Again, majorities, but there is a discrepancy between white and non-white respondents on this as well. Relationship between police and my neighborhood is excellent. Again, majorities agreeing with this, but almost 20-point disparity between white and non-white respondents. Here, police that serve my area can be trusted. There's a 10-point discrepancies, but still very large majorities of both white and non-white respondents. Police should live in the area they serve. Here, very close, but non-whites actually are more likely to agree with that statement. Race and ethnic bias are serious problems. We don't see majorities here agreeing. They're actually roughly the same here between white and non-white respondents. Similar for race and ethnicity determined treatment by police. Here we see a little bit more of a difference. but only about 8 percentage points. Race and ethnicity determined treatment by the courts, again, slightly larger percentage of non-whites, but not a very large difference. So the key takeaways from the survey we'd like to leave you with are that there was a lot of agreement across these survey samples, even though there was a great deal of disparity on racial ethnic identity, on education, and on income in many cases, and that there's a substantial agreement across the survey samples that racism and ethnic bias are problems in our area in general, as well as in the police treatment and in the court systems. And that there's a great deal of support for trying to find other ways to deal with problems in the neighborhood, like domestic violence, misbehavior due to mental illness. And so that would suggest that we should really be focusing some attention on those areas. And there was a great agreement across the samples that police should live in the areas they serve. And as Bamende said earlier, we don't know for sure what that means, but it suggests a desire for an improved relationship between residents of the community and the police that serve them. And of course, all of these things, non-white respondents were much more likely to agree with than others. And so the other key takeaway from this survey that we hope that we can lead the community with is that Governor Cuomo's directive really asks that there is grassroots participation and that the voice of the community be heard. And so we offer this as data that can be used by any police unit that's trying to meet the demands at the state level. And we look forward to answering any questions that you might have about this to help you use the data in the most effective way possible for you. So thank you so much for your attention. And I'd like to turn it over now to Frank Anechiarico, professor at Hamilton College, who'll talk about the best practices research that our group has produced.
Thank you very much, Ronnie. Thank you, Bamende, Ronnie. As Patrick mentioned a moment ago, there are several parts to the effort that we launched last summer in response to the racial justice movement and the governor's executive order. There was the webinar, the 3 surveys that were just described. And then we also did at Hamilton and Utica colleges intensive research into best practices around the country and reported on those in some detail. The report can be found on our website, communityforjustice.org, which many of you used to register for this webinar. The executive order is there as well. Let me share the screen for you to show you some specifics of this. Okay, this is basically the front page of the report. The executive order is very important, I think, to look at. The governor uses very strong language, or whoever in his office wrote this. I think it's instructive. This is not general. This is quite specific in what is being required of, as it says at the top there, such local government. That means every local government in New York State that operates a law enforcement agency. There are 500 of them, 24 in Oneida and Herkimer counties. They need to convene local police agencies, stakeholders, and develop a plan. And the next phrase is motivated us, evidence-based policing strategies. That's what we focused on very intensively in our research. What does the evidence show works, right? We're not looking into the air for these ideas. We're looking at what has been tried and proven. And then very specific also into the areas that we should look for evidence. Use of force, procedural justice. When a policeman encounters a citizen, a police person, how is that done? Systemic racial bias, implicit bias awareness, de-escalation is a very important factor as well. Diversion programs. Important part of this as well, that's not on the section that I have here, but this is all must be submitted to Albany by April 1st by the public officials in charge of these political jurisdictions. And there's teeth to it. The Division of Budget can withhold funding, both federal and state funding, not just the police, but to the entire municipality, county, or town. So these are going to be assessed by the state. So as it says on the bottom here, the entire process requires citizen input. That's why we held the webinar and did the survey. But beyond that, when the plans come out, which they're beginning to do now, the County of Oneida submitted its plan for public review last Friday. The City of Utica will do so tomorrow. Rome did it yesterday. Several of the towns are ready to do so. What should we as citizens look for in the police reform plans that are proposed? This is a time to get active on this issue. This is of concern to many people. It's a time to have your voice heard. Okay, there are, as we look through the literature and the research that's been done on this matter and the workbook that went along with the governor's executive order, we find 5 basic principles that emerge that should be considered by the executives and the community members that are coming up with these plans, and that should be used by the rest of us as citizens in assessing them. The first is transparency. The idea that police agencies make policies, administer them. All these policies should be available to us. They should be clearly articulated. The way that is done in many other layers of government, we should be able to see what the basic rules are that are being used to maintain order in our communities. The second is oversight. It needs to be a way for every government agency that exercises some power over us to be checked and balanced. There are a number of ways of doing this. We'll talk about a few of those in a moment. Racial justice must permeate all of this. We should assess every proposal that's made by a municipality, or for that matter, the lack of proposals, if they're not being done carefully and seriously, as to whether or not racial justice is being improved. Things like driving while black, things like over-policing in certain neighborhoods, things like Patrick was talking about a moment ago, in the way people are talked to. Community orientation. This is the involvement at every level of people in the community who should be, again, involved with the setting of policies and the way they're administered. And then finally, coordination. There may be some parts of these reform plans that are better accomplished mutually by a number of departments. This may be especially true in smaller municipalities and jurisdictions in our area. So what we did in our report, that is, as I mentioned, available online, is to break it down into these 8 different areas. Mental illness, traffic stops, oversight, domestic disputes, diversity, trial and inmate reentry, and then education and sensitivity. In each of those categories, as I say, we've done broad research that is carefully cited, so you can dig deeper if you'd like to in any of those areas. Now, I wish I had time to, here's the website, by the way, where all this can be found. And in addition, as I mentioned, to other resources and actually the recordings of the webinars that we did in the fall that Patrick mentioned. Well, here actually, what I don't have time to go in detail, is an abstraction of the reforms that we found to be evidence-based under each of those categories. Some of them are very, I think, very sort of publicly prominent, some of them not so much. But what I'd like to do in the remaining time here before we open it to questions, I have to go to, sorry, Professor Hyman before we do that, but look at a few things. These are 3 important problems and 3 well-tested solutions to them. Racial profiling, right? Driving while black, walking while black. It's a serious problem, well documented. But right in our neighboring municipality here in Syracuse, in October, they passed the Right to Know law, a procedural justice initiative that addresses this in specific. First of all, when an officer stops a citizen, the officer must identify him or herself, what jurisdiction they're from, and the reason for the stop. If that concludes the interaction, before leaving, the officer gives the citizen a card, which enables the citizen with a website and a phone number to evaluate the interaction. Now, if the interaction continues, the citizen will still get the card at the end. If, as the next step, the officer, without a warrant or probable cause, asks to search the person or the person's vehicle, that interaction, the request and the response must be recorded, and the officer must inform the citizen that they have the right to refuse the search. These are investigative stops very often. They're often called pretextual stops. And Syracuse decided that this was an occasion for bias. Not always, but occasionally, and around the country quite frequently. The next step of this allows us to see just how this is deployed. Quarterly, the department must report on the racial breakdown of stops and searches. So if there is profiling going on, it will become evident fairly quickly. Whereas racialized assumptions of criminality in crisis situations is a serious problem that's recognized fairly well. The Rochester delegation in the state legislature has proposed Daniel's Law, named after Daniel Prude, a man in mental health crisis who died in the street there, and a situation that was covered up by Rochester police and municipality for some months. This is going to allow funds to be supplied to municipalities to bring mental health professionals and social workers along on these crisis calls, and in some cases deploy them without police if there does not seem to be a threat of violence. That's a very important innovation, supported by police, I might add, quite actively. And then last, a civilian review. There's something called an auditor model, where you actually have a reviewer in the department who will assess the way the department operates its procedures and policies. As I understand it, Utica is moving in this direction with their reform committee, and that's very positive. Let me turn this over now to Professor Bernard Hyman at Utica College, who will continue reviewing what we found in this research. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. Well, let me first begin by saying, as the final speaker, before we head into the question and answer period, that I would caution everyone that 1 hour is surely not enough time for us to adequately delve into the depth and breadth of this very complex issue that we're facing in criminal justice, and frankly, with regard to race in America. So we are highlighting some findings here tonight. We obviously are going to give you some highlights of what we found. You've heard some of that tonight, but there's so much more to be talked about. First, let me say, make no mistake, the devil is always in the details, and we have to do further research, and we're going to have to do a lot more work to address the issues of race in our country. So tonight, it's my job to touch on three issues with regard to our findings and some recommendations in best practices for those three areas. The first one would be personnel diversity in law enforcement, the trial process, and then re-entry of formerly incarcerated persons. Earlier, you heard Professors Bemende and Tishner mention a little bit about residency and the desire for residency within your community. This is directly related to the issue of police personnel diversity within a law enforcement agency. I think the answer goes well beyond just simple residency, but when folks are seeing people come in from outside their community to do the policing, and then, as Mr. Johnson indicated, and then talk to them as though they do not understand that they're people, that creates a huge issue. And to really highlight this issue, let's just take a look at law enforcement in our area. Our community is 41% non-white. And yet our law enforcement agencies locally are 6% non-white. And that creates an issue, and that tells us that there is an issue with diversifying the police agencies that serve our community. Interestingly enough, if you want to sit back and you want to think, well, wait, okay, I get it, that's an issue, and not really understand totally that it's actually an issue that law enforcement shares, because one of the jobs we had at Utica College was to interview law enforcement officers as part of the research. Especially, we sat down and interviewed multiple law enforcement executives, chiefs of police, county sheriff, and so forth. And they've expressed the same concerns, except that one of the things we found is that while they may have expressed those concerns, we've found that the recruitment and the diversity of those forces has not changed. A couple of things that inform us in our research is, one, the paramilitary culture of policing, the us versus them kind of culture that is promulgated in the training and so forth. The idea that conformity suppresses individuality. Those are barriers. That creates a barrier to recruitment of a diverse force. That's not the only barrier. That's not the only barrier when we look at it. We look at other things such as residency, as we talked about. And interestingly enough, one of the things we found is that as we've looked at the paramilitary culture that is instilled in the training, one of the best practices we found, however, comes from the military. And the military having done some more directed recruiting approaches that kind of go away from this traditional way of recruiting folks. One of the issues we have locally or within the entire state that law enforcement and the community have railed about is that a system exists wherein we think, because it is a system that fundamentally says, okay, the rules are the same for everybody, that everybody follows the same rules, therefore it is fair. Well, what seems fair is not always fair. And so the civil service system we have in place currently now is an additional barrier to actually creating a more diverse hiring force. So what are some of the other approaches out there to hiring? We know that in higher education, they've tried what they call cluster hires, a directed approach, an intentional approach to go out and hire a group of folks that would more adequately reflect the community, which would mean going beyond, say, for instance, the rule of civil service that says we're going to grab the top 3 performers on a civil service test, rather than reaching down and maybe looking for the better candidates that may exist below that. There is no real number wherein we can rely upon to say that that person will be a better police officer than those others just because they didn't score in the top 3. So that's one of the reforms that we'd be looking for in these proposals that are headed to the governor. With regard to the second and third ideas, what happens in the courts? What happens in reentry? Those 2 issues are actually very much related, because the pipeline that we're talking about for reentry starts in the courts. The sentences that are handed out in the courts determine what happens to someone once they re-enter society after leaving prison or even after leaving a local jail. Convictions have consequences, and some of those consequences equal bars to employment, bars to appropriate housing, and frankly, a bar to continue a good life beyond that title that you're given or that label that's thrown upon a person when they're labeled as a felon. So a couple of the interesting things that we found in our research as far as best practices, and these are things that are actually practiced somewhat here locally. For instance, conviction integrity units. A conviction integrity unit is a unit that will review some cases randomly selected sometimes, or cases that are brought before the group in order to review to make sure that the evidence was sound and that the underlying conviction is sound. And why are we concerned with this conviction integrity? Because we know that within the plea bargaining process, there are some biases that result in convictions that may not, in fact, be based on evidence, but based on the pressure that the accused feels. Other programs we look at, second chance programs, for instance. Oneida County has a second chance program. In fact, I sit on that committee currently. And that second chance program allows for the expungement of someone's record after a period of time. One of the other best practices that we've noted in the manual is one where we would put a system in place that would expand that to have automatic expungement. not to have a system whereby people would have to actually apply and know that the program exists, but one that says, if you have stayed out of trouble, if you have done productive things in society, that you would be eligible for this and it would be automatic. We've seen some processes in our system that have changed, that have changed over the last few years. For instance, we've had the bail reform, we've had new laws in discovery, and so forth. So what we're looking at is continuing to broaden those categories where we can improve things for folks. One last thought. I know I'm at the end of my time and we'll be opening up to questions, but one last thought. As I said earlier, this problem is beyond just the criminal justice system. One thing we have to think about is when we're thinking about race in America and we automatically take our discussion to criminal justice, there's an underlying assumption there that is very, very uncomfortable. As though when we improve the criminal justice system, that somehow, some way, we have automatically improved the life of Black women and Black men and non-whites in this country. And nothing of the sort can be true. Why? Because not everybody is in that pipeline of the criminal justice system. I hope not. I hope that's not what we assume, that every Black and brown person is going to end up in that system. So when we're talking about systems that are unfair, the criminal justice system is just one. And we need to start thinking about education as another system to be fixed. Why? Because we know, and I know, having been a prosecutor, sitting in a courtroom for a day and listening to defendants who are about to be sent off to prison, being asked the question, how far did you go in school? And to have to sit there and see a number of them say 8th grade, 7th grade. As that door closed behind them, nothing could shock you more. The less education, the more years that person would receive. So with that in mind, we now open it up to questions and answers from the audience. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Bernie. And thank everybody. We're starting to get a number of very good questions coming in here. I'll field them, but my fellow panelists should feel free to jump in. First one has to do with the survey. And one of the webinar participants asked, why are the results for Cornhill the only results portrayed for a specific geographic region? The survey was conducted through different media, but for the purposes of understanding the results, why weren't all the results perhaps broken down by area? Bamende, you want to take that one?
Yes, no, that's actually a really good question. So for presentation purposes, we had a limited amount of time. We wanted to present the results at the highest level of sample aggregation. So the Cornhill results are presented from a specific geographic region, but that's where all the responses were. Similarly, with the Zogby survey, we wanted to present all of the responses as with the 2-in-1. So that was the reason for the Cornhill is a different level, but in terms of what's the highest way in which we can aggregate it, each one is presented in that manner. But as your question suggests, we can break it down further in other presentations we have. So here towards the end, you saw the Zogby results broken down, white, non-white, but in the past, we've also broken down the Zogby results by region. So looking at Utica, looking at the rest of Oneida, looking at the rest of Herkimer. So that's definitely something that can be done. It was for the purposes of presentation. We just wanted to present it aggregated, each sample aggregated at the highest level.
The other thing I would add to that is that there was actually very little racial and ethnic diversity in the original Zogby sample. It was a random sample, and that produced a very high proportion of folks who identify as white. And so one of the things that Zogby said in their executive summary was it'd be great to go out and look for some more diversity along those lines because there were so few folks who were not identified as white. And so that's one of the reasons that we decided to go into Cornhill to try to find a sample there. So that's why there's the contrast there on that particular geographic area.
Yeah, and there's another question about the survey, just quickly, when talking about white and non-white, where do refugees fit in? And as I recall, Ronnie, maybe you can help me with this. We did have a question as to whether or not you were born in
Yes.
the United States.
Yes.
So it is possible to break out people who are immigrants.
It is, but we only had about 1% of the population. We wanted to capture that diversity, and we were surprised that it just wasn't there in the folks that happened to be contacted for the survey.
Okay, very good. Number of other questions are popping up here. Patrick, here's one about the high level of trust that we find in the Zogby survey. Doesn't that indicate that really there really is no problem in this area, and maybe we don't need very much in the way of reform?
Oh, thank you for the question, Frank, and thank you for the person that asked it. Actually, when you look at Black and brown communities in the Mohawk Valley and Oneida County, even though I want to emphasize that there has been notable progress made, especially in the last 10 years, we are far from communities of color being able to trust the police. Am I on the right track with the question, Frank?
Yes.
Yeah. So with historically across America, especially with African Americans and people who identify as Latinx, if you will, Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, the darker you are in this country, unfortunately, and I'm not speaking for all Black and brown people, I want to emphasize that. But by the time, and this is an anecdotal assessment, by the time most Black and brown folks hit the age of 30, many of them have had a less than positive experience with a police officer. And it's probably far younger than that. They've either directly been impacted negatively by a police officer, or they have witnessed an encounter that was short of traumatizing. So we do have a problem in this community and across New York State. I will say again, there has been progress made, but there's still a substantial ways to go, where we create an environment where people historically who have felt marginalized feel that they can trust the people who are hired to protect and serve them.
Thank you, Patrick. Bernie?
I just wanted to add that, you know, the basis of our country is not just simply to follow majority rule and how the majority feels is the be all and end all. The majority has to rule with some level of compassion toward those who are not in the same situation. And these polls speak to that issue. So the greater community, the county, which is much more white, it will have a different set of results than we will have in the communities that have more police presence. Because really, when we're asking questions about police interactions, we should go where those police interactions are taking place. So when we asked countywide, no one was surprised to see that the countywide results were very, very different than what we found in the Cornhill community. And there should be no excuse for us to therefore ignore what we see, the difference that we see there. We have to pay attention to it. So for us to just say, well, the Zogby poll proves there's no problem, would be to ignore a sentiment that's only going to grow if we continue to ignore it, which we're seeing now.
Thank you, Bernie. Thank you, Bernie. There are a couple of questions about the plans that municipalities have to submit that the governor's executive order is requiring, and some problems that people are writing in about in getting access to them, whether or not they've had any role to play in them. And then what can we do to get hold of them, or a couple of answers and questions in that direction. I might take this one. The people who must sign, if you look in the workbook that was sent out by the state, at the end of it, there's a very formal document that must be signed by the chief executive officer of the village, town, county, or city with a police agency. It says, yes, we have gone through this process as specified in the executive order, and I attest to it. So they are the people who should be contacted directly about what the plans are. They are the ones that they're all elected in this area. They have some responsibility to respond to you. So I would go directly to them. The media have been reporting. There was a report just today in the paper about the Rome city a plan that's just been published. You can find these plans on the websites of these government agencies. I know that limits it to people who have computers, but they should be available in printed form as well, with a little bit more trouble, I'm afraid. But yes, there's an absolute requirement by the state that these be made public before that chief executive officer can sign and attest to the fact that they have been made public. Okay, a couple more questions. Maybe this goes back to Mende and Ronnie. Should we do regular surveys to find out what's going on in the community? Should we have a sort of perhaps an annual or quarterly way of finding out what people think? Ronnie, I want to try that one?
I would say yes. As somebody who lives in the world of data, yes, more data are always better. I mean, taking the temperature of what's going on is a good thing, and the folks consuming this information should just keep in mind that we're limited in the kinds of questions we could ask. So we tried to ask the most basic, the most pertinent questions to the issue that the municipalities are dealing with in the in the coming months as we were preparing this. But there were all kinds of questions we wanted to ask about community climate, about police interactions that we just weren't able to. I mean, there are more data that we can share, and we're happy to do that, happy to talk about it, happy to help people think about it if it feels like it's overwhelming to people who are trying to use it. But I would say yes, because there are more questions that we wanted to ask, even just in this moment in time. And so more information is better. I mean, to go back to what Bernie was talking about, tracking or actually, Frank, you were talking about this, tracking the racial divisions in terms of racial counts, in terms of what kind of interactions are happening. More data is always better, because then you'll know what's actually happening instead of guessing. And
then part of transparency, of course, is to make this very public.
Yes.
The idea of this municipal dashboards, where there's a whole series of assessments of different ways that government interacts with citizens that are available to the public readily, very easily. And data on the way the police interact with the public should be part of that. A couple of interesting questions. One about that's relevant to whether or not police officers should live in the area they serve. How many officers are from or live in Cornhill is one question. Do we know that, Patrick?
Personally, I don't have the answer to that. But in general, and I'm going to speak as a person of color, because too often Black and brown people feel that they are not approached and used a tone, spoken to by police officers with a tone of humanity. And the feeling is, for many people, is that if they lived in the same neighborhood, they would experience things and see things the way that they did. As Bernie or someone pointed out, police departments in this region are overwhelmingly white and male. To be Black in America is to understand that we don't just experience racism with law enforcement, we experience it with just about every institution and system that we have to engage in. Often, when those encounters don't go well with education and other institutions, what people do is typically call the police. And unfortunately, that's when things too often escalate. However, yeah, I'm going to say it's so nice when we see a police officer show humanity and dignity to everybody that they are engaging with. It's just such a welcome breath of fresh air. So yeah, it's nice when police live in communities that they serve. The feeling is, amongst many people, is that they will show more respect to the people that they are hired to protect and serve.
Let me turn to our other. Thank you very much, Patrick. I think let me turn to our other data scientist, Bamende. Question here about, should rank and file police officers have been polled? Should we have collected data from them on the problems of policing and suggested solutions?
Yeah, actually, I would definitely agree with that. One part of this is, getting community input, but these officers are part of the communities as well. And I kind of piggybacking off of what Ronnie said earlier, more information is always better. So getting their thoughts, their perspective on, same questions and questions that are going to be specific to the occupation, I think is actually a very good idea.
And we have a couple more minutes, but Bernie, perhaps you'd like to answer that too.
I was just going to say, we did talk to several of the police chiefs and the heads of departments. I think part of our process at the point when we were asking these questions is that we may not have gathered the best data at the time, that the emotions running about things and the distrust might have had a bad effect on the data we put together. So talking with the law enforcement officials or the executives, I think was the better approach for that time. But I do think gathering more data and actually talking with police officers now that this process has moved along, I think we may have built enough trust that they'd be willing to give us some honest answers and work with us.
Right, we're getting toward the end of the broadcast portion, and I would remind the people who are joining us through the webinar to stick with us, and we'll continue this discussion for a while after the broadcast ends. But I would also point out, apropos of this question about interviewing police officers, that we're not done with our research, and that neither does the cause of racial justice in law enforcement and criminal justice end on April 1st, when when the reports must go to Albany. Really, in many ways, it's just the beginning. The changes that will be proposed and put in place need to be evaluated. Some of it may be just talk. Some of it may be more than that. Some things that look fairly benign or fairly small may turn out to be wonderful. These are things that should be assessed. We who represent the colleges in the area and community groups such as Patrick, we want to stay engaged with this and offer ourselves as a clearinghouse and also research centers for this kind of inquiry. Let me just once again remind you, if you're watching, if you want more information about what's happening here, please go to community4justice.org. And there's a great deal of information there, as I say, from all three parts of what we've been doing for the last 6 months. Okay, well, I think we continue now. Those of you who are watching on TV are probably going to be cut off here in a couple of minutes. But let me, at this point, go to a couple more questions. They're still coming in, which is terrific. Important question here. In the governor's order, the language is reform and reinvent. What do we find out about reinvention from looking at the plans so far? I think that's a very good point. The way that the governor talked about this whole effort is he called it a reinvention collaboratory, right? That it was supposed to be a sort of a statewide effort to really rethink the police from the bottom up. Is that going to happen everywhere? No. It will happen, I think, most directly and probably most dramatically where people put pressure on local governments to do so. But what about that? Let me get some other perspectives from the group here. Ronnie, what about that idea of reinvention? Can we expect the police to reinvent themselves?
I think we can expect them to reimagine how they do some things. For example, we were talking about this idea of better trust between police and community members and creating a more diverse police force that looks more like the community. What if we started recruiting students in high school, right, or middle school? We went into communities where we know that we don't have the kind of representation that we'd like to have. And we say, okay, let's think about a police career. What would that look like for you? What would you have to do in terms of grades? Can we get you a mentor who is a police officer, who works with you after school on your homework? I mean, there are lots of things that we could do differently, right? Instead of saying, well, we take the exam or we send ads out and this is who comes and therefore this is who we hire. Can we rethink how we get people in the hiring process? So
Right.
yes, I think we can do that.
Other perspectives on that from the panel? Yeah, please.
I was gonna add to that. There's mention of downstate, they use police athletic leagues that begin early. And those institutions have been in place for years, and modeling that type of organization locally would actually be a great idea. They not only provide after-school programming for students, besides the athletics, the athletic league actually provides after-school activities for students, tutoring, and a whole host of other things, and also provides direct contact between police officers and students in those underserved communities. So I think that's a great idea.
Yeah, I would make maybe a plug for, I think I agree with all of that. The idea that I think it was mentioned several times, Bernie, you mentioned it earlier, about the us versus them mentality. Well, I think one of the things that the co-response teams, that is including a mental health or social worker professional in the car, changes the perspective of the officer on the job. It's not us versus them. It's not just order maintenance, it's community health.
Right.
It's allowing this community to be well. And if we begin to see the police as part of that effort, rather than a distinct, and you're quite right to mention, paramilitary organization that occupies an area rather than is part of it. I think that's maybe what the reinvention word is aimed at, that I think we can work on. Again, I might mention the Community Foundation's effort to have an impact center in Utica that will try to bring together a number of services in one place that will foster community wellness and will include the police. So a couple more questions here. They're coming in. Another question here is, yeah, what about this idea of defunding the police? That's something that we've heard. It sort of became a bit of a political football during the election campaigns in the fall. When we hear that phrase, what should we think about it? Bemende, you want to grab that one?
Sure. And it's interesting because I had a conversation about the phrase a couple of weeks ago with someone else who does research in this area, because when you hear the phrase defunding the police, I think a lot of people think, oh, you're going to take all their money away, you're going to take all their equipment away, they can't do the job. But it's a lot more complex than that. It involves in some instances, redirecting resources to, as you mentioned before, crisis response teams, so that you can facilitate these new ways of interacting with the community. So it might be, okay, in terms this area of responsibility for the police, maybe if we can use some of that money to hire additional social workers or psychologists to help them. And in the conversation I had with this other professor about the phrase, I said, do you think that the phrase is what put up a huge defensiveness in this area? And he actually agreed a bit with the phrase perhaps being slightly problematic because people don't understand what it means. I think you've been in conversations where a number of police officers have said dealing with the mental health calls are really difficult and we would like additional assistance with that. Well, that could involve a redirection of resources that all parties agree with. And technically that could fall under that defunding the police umbrella. It doesn't mean completely handicapping the police. It means rethinking how you're going to use the resources. So I think understanding what the phrase really means is really helpful, but a lot of people have a hard time moving past the phrase defunding.
Yeah, thank you, Mende. The question just came in. We did have this on our survey about police in the schools. And this is an issue that I believe someone who raises it about the police in the schools in Clinton, and I believe they're also in schools in a number of other jurisdictions, including Utica, in the area. What about that? Is that something that should be rethought? Do either of you recall how that came out in the survey?
I don't remember that we specifically asked that question about being in the school.
Oh, okay, maybe that was one of the ones that we thought about asking, but we never quite.
We had limited space, so we had to trim a lot of things.
That's right. Well, yeah, I think this is something that's pretty significant. I think the movement in reinvented police departments around the country has been away from it. I think the idea, once again, perhaps similar to what we were just discussing about alternative responses to mental illness and domestic violence, I think also an alternative to an armed police officer in a school is probably a good idea. I mean, sort of modeling the police as, you know, sort of a kind of a giant presence for little kids. It may not be the best way to do things. Anybody else have something on that? May have thought about this. Yeah, Bernie, go ahead, please.
Yeah, Frank, you'd be amazed. Actually, the law enforcement professionals that we spoke with, in fact, supported that. A lot of what we're talking about here is actually supported by them on the basis that they have been asked to do too many things, so many things that their identity isn't always clear. Are they an enforcement mechanism? Are they a compassion mechanism? Are they a social worker? Are they mental health staff? They are being asked to do things in such varied ways that really they end up with no direction. So I think that goes right back to the defunding the police question, because what some people have really concentrated on the defunding is the defunding the militarization of law enforcement, of the police. A lot of people are seeing the big vehicles, such as Utica has the Armadillo, which was a vehicle purchased, a used military vehicle purchased by the city of Utica. Things like that have sparked that conversation, and I think it goes back to this. And I will tell you, I grew up in New York City. I'm not a Utica native. I grew up in New York City, and I went to a junior high school where we had to be wanded and go through metal detectors every day. There's nothing like that feeling as though the minute you walk into school, you are distrusted and you are, well, to a degree, not wanted. So it's not that you get the feeling that you're walking into a place in your community that's there to serve you and teach you and treat you as a human being. You are part of the problem the minute you walk in, and that creates a huge problem.
Yeah.
Thank you, Bernie. Patrick, did you have something on that one?
Yeah, just a couple of thoughts and comments. It goes without saying, we live in a very complicated world. And when we see gun violence in schools perpetrated by civilians, you can make an easy argument that you need armed police officers in the schools to keep everybody safe. That aside, I believe the key is there's nothing like seeing a good police officer, regardless of his racial identity. Policing is tough as it is, it's really about good customer service. And a really good police officer knows how to go into an escalated situation. Admittedly, it can be tough, but knows how to talk to people. As people of color, Black people, we often have to, and I say this with all due respect, we often have to understand the world that we live in because it's largely run by white people. So we have to study them, we have to analyze them, we have to know how to keep them comfortable. Police officers, if they are overwhelmingly white, they should understand, analyze, and ask questions about Black people. And I'm saying that since Black people have been here in America, we've always had to understand people who are white. And my point is, good police officers, if they are white, they should understand communities that they are policing, especially when they are culturally and racially different. I've heard it once said that a good police officer, if they have to make an arrest, they can do it respectfully, or even the person getting arrested will say, I respect Officer Joe because he or she always talks to me respectfully. So know the salt of the community you are policing, whether it's in a school or whatever, because that is the smoothest, and yet you could be the toughest cop that there is, but you know the terrain of the neighborhood and you know the families. You take the time to get them to know, you take the time to get to know them when things are at peace and not at war.
Well, thank you, Patrick. Those are both thank you very much. Very interesting question here. Bernie, maybe you can take this one about the large number. Obviously, the largest police department in the state is the NYPD. Second would be the New York State Police, and of course, their patrols are sometimes remanded locally. What about relying on the state police, who have perhaps more professionalized training than particularly maybe some of the very smallest departments, as a method of reform? Can we rely on, or perhaps enlarge the state police and have them take more responsibility for local policing? Is that a good idea? Can't hear you, Bernie.
That mute button gets me every time. I think it's a mixed bag. I think that, again, avoids the question of reinvention. They too are a paramilitary organization with the same training, taught to act in a certain manner. We assume because it's the state organization that their training is that much better, but be assured that they are accredited in the same manner.
Okay, that's right. That's right. The accreditation problem. Yeah.
Oh, something's happening with my video, just completely.
We can hear you. We can hear you.
So what I was going to say is, when you add to that the idea that there are times when the state police have been slow to come to things as well that are given reforms. For instance, body cams. For those of you who don't realize this, but some of our local agencies have had body cams for years now. Body-worn cameras have been worn in the city of Utica for years. Some of the other local agencies haven't come along, but guess who else had not come along? And actually, I don't believe they're fully equipped with them yet, is the state police. So we can't make the assumption. We just can't make that jump. Not to say that they're any worse or any better. There are issues.
There are a couple of questions that I think we might want to respond to. Thank you, Bernie. About, maybe Cornhill is the place where there's the most crime. So shouldn't there be the most cops? Wouldn't we expect that to be the case? Now, one of the things we did discover in our research, and this is something that we didn't uncover for the first time, is that there's a proclivity to arrest people in minority neighborhoods, that the police are there in larger numbers. And to some degree, if you look at the number of young people who use marijuana, for instance, the white and the black numbers are the same, right? If you looked in New Hartford or if you looked in Cornhill, the proportion of kids using marijuana is the same. How many kids using marijuana are getting arrested in New Hartford versus Cornhill? Right? There's an assumption of criminality in these neighborhoods, and people will be arrested on it. So it's not that there's more crime there, but there are more arrests. There's more police presence. So I think that's kind of one way of responding to that. Would anybody else like to take that one on? This idea that, the police are where the crime is.
Yeah, and I think I would just like to amplify what you said there, Frank. I make this point to my students all the time when I'm talking about this issue, is that, I've never had a ticket for moving violation. And I always knock on wood when I say that. Is it because I haven't deserved one? Oh, heck no, right? But if I had a police officer following me all the time, they would find me doing things wrong on the road and I would have tickets. It's a surveillance issue. I just want to put a real fine point on that, most of us could not withstand the kind of scrutiny that some communities of color are subjected to, and stay out of jail, right? So I just really wanted to underscore what you said about the racial bias, right, that we talked about, that causes the extra policing, even over policing of certain communities. And if you follow people around long enough, you'll find a reason to stop them, question them. And if they have the history that Patrick's been talking about of mistrust and poor treatment by the police, then things can escalate very quickly.
Yes, this is the pretextual stops that we were talking about a little earlier, investigative stops. And I think, for people listening, if there's one thing you want to hold your local community's feet to the fire about, it's this: the right to know law benefits everybody. We're not just talking about, particular communities, but this is just a basic, it seems to me, democratic reform that ought to be put in place in all communities. That is, officer tells you who they are, what they're stopping you for, and if they want to search you, they have to inform you of your right, right? Rather than intimidating you. very often, and there are actually a good number of instances of this. I want to search your car, or I'm going to search your car, or let me search your car, right? But the Syracuse law is very different from that and puts the justice back in the procedure. I think I think we're getting to the bottom of the question here. So perhaps I give everybody a chance to make a final statement about this. Let's see, Bernie, do you want to start us out there? You're muted at the moment. There you go. You're back in with us.
I'm back. I've been just messing around with that video. Well, as a final statement, I would just repeat what I said a little bit earlier, is that this is really a complex issue. And as we discuss it, we should be thinking about broader issues as well. My thought process is we can actually address some of the problems by stopping the pipeline that creates the problems in the criminal justice system. If we can stop people from entering the system as well, that helps us. What that also does is it sort of transforms, because the thought process is that you have, we talk about defunding the police. Well, there could be a situation where we naturally defund the police, because everything in public administration and budgeting is based on need. And
right.
Frankly, if we change how we're doing business and we restructure how we're doing business, each community will change what they need from police and how they are serviced. So that's one of the things that I think about when we think about a broader set of changes that have to come. So when we think about economic issues, socioeconomic issues, and education, I think those are the things we have to really try and do some programming and other things to combat those problems, so we can cut off that pipeline into the system and help alleviate the problems on the other end of it.
Right. Oh, thank you, Bernie. Bemende?
Thanks, Frank. One of the key things that I want to state about the initiative is the importance of centering those marginalized voices. It was a privilege coding the Cornhill surveys, because once again, in terms of this conversation is not new, but what has put the national spotlight on it is the treatment of marginalized communities, especially African-American communities. So throughout this process, just the importance of making sure that you are listening to the communities, and it's work to have individuals from those communities reply and tell you some of the experiences. So if you are trying to get their feedback, it's our responsibility and the responsibility of governments to make sure that there's going to be some follow-up. You can't continually say to these communities, we want to hear from you, and then not do anything about it. So one of the great things about this initiative is, this process right here, giving these voices a platform. So continuing to do that, I think centering the marginalized voices is a key component of any racial justice initiative, especially with police reform.
Thank you very much, Bemende. Ronnie?
I guess I would just echo some of the things that Patrick and Bernie have said about this being a larger issue and about the importance of addressing systemic racism. I mean, we're focused on criminal justice reform and reimagining right now because social media has brought us to the point where white people can no longer ignore the life and death struggle that many African-American communities have with the criminal justice system and with law enforcement in particular. But we have to think about this as a bigger problem and think about all the other ways in which we need to be moving towards racial justice. So this is a good place to start because it is a matter of life and death, but so are a lot of other things. The pandemic shows us the health disparities and so on. And so we'll tackle one thing at a time, but just remembering that it's part of a larger puzzle that we have to take apart and put back together again.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ronnie. Patrick.
Yeah, I want to start off by trailing what Ronnie just said. Racism in America, in New York State, and in this community, it's insidious. It's the invisible virus. So it's not just in law enforcement, it's in education, it's in lending institutions, and it's something that people of color often have to be on guard about for their safety their sanity, and their well-being. Back to policing, it's complicated. It's tough work. But I think what I would say, if I had the opportunity to speak to every police officer in this country, and I know right now we're focusing on Oneida and Herkimer County, I would say be open to feedback from the experiences that Black and brown people are having in this community. Be open, set up town halls. Let's, sensitivity training and all of that is essential. You can't have enough of it. And, I at the beginning, I thank the Utica Police Department, the mayor. I also want to salute the United County District Attorney's Office, who has done substantial work in being more progressive at meeting the needs of the people. Here in Oneida County and Herkimer County, we still have a ways to go. And I think it's about everybody being open, the community and law enforcement. The goal is everybody wants to go home safely, and people want to feel treated. People want to feel that they're treated safely and respected. Right now, the focus is on police reform. So let's keep doing the good work. And it's been an honor to work with all of you, but this doesn't end tonight. As Bernie said, we're going to need a lot more than an hour and a half to improve the climate of police and community relationships. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Patrick. Let me conclude with just a couple of points. I think mentioned earlier that we want to sort of alert people to the things they should look for when they communicate with their public officials, when they look at these plans. We want to look for transparency, that's being built into the system so we can all see what's happening inside our departments. We want to look for independent oversight. Right? This has to be, whether it's a civilian board or an auditor that's put in place, independent review is vital. And then finally, procedural justice. And a good example of that is the Syracuse right to know law, something that should be considered by every town council, county council in the area. And then secondly, just briefly, we're following this broadcast up with workshops for public officials who have to respond to the governor in two groups in Oneida County, February 25th. These are being conducted through the president's office at MVCC, February 25th for the smaller departments in the area, and March 3rd for the larger departments. Encourage your public officials to attend. This will be a way for them to listen to each other and to assess these best practices. There's one in Herkimer County on February 22nd being conducted through the president's office at Herkimer College. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us tonight out there in Radio Land. And my colleagues here on the panel, what a pleasure to work with you. Good night to everyone, and let's work for a better community. Okay, good night now. Bye-bye.
Good night, everybody.
Good night. Thank you.